We are joined today by the Reverend Jonathan Vanderbeck to talk some more about pandemic self-care and healthy practices from the perspective of a licensed clinical therapist. If you are a listener of the podcast, you know that we are big fans of therapy, and so we're super excited to have a licensed therapist giving some practical advice. He's not going to be your therapist, but but is a therapist, giving some sort of like perspective from a therapist. I know it's important for therapists to make sure that they know that you're not Jonathan's not going to be your therapist, but this is still really informed advice. So before we dive in, just to tell you a little bit more about Jonathan, the Reverend Jonathan Vanderbeck, LCSW, who uses he and they pronouns, is an ordained minister in the Reformed Church in America, the oldest Protestant denomination in the United States, where he was the first openly gay person of color ordained in his denomination, and is also a licensed clinical social worker in the state of New York. They currently serve as the interim transitional minister at Mathieu Lutheran Church in Rotterdam, New York, and are also in practice at the Samaritan Counseling Center in Scotia, New York. He has received extensive training in Bowen family systems theory and is passionate about working with individuals and couples from a systemic perspective, working to help others see the anxiety around them. When they're not working and it's not a global pandemic, you can find them drinking coffee at a coffee shop, extra dry cappuccino, cooking an elaborate meal, or hiking in the Adirondack Mountains. Thank you, Reverend Jonathan, so much for being on our show today. As I said in the intro, we did a Facebook Live with you like about a year ago talking about sort of the emerging pandemic. And now that we're a year into lockdown in the United States and over a year sort of this outbreak worldwide, we thought it'd be good to like revisit some of what you shared to sort of what still holds and what new things you would add into the mix. So just thank you for being here with us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Brian and Shay, for having me back here. It's hard to believe that it was about, I think today's the 13th. I think it was about a year exactly that we recorded this.
Yeah.
Um, and it's wild to me to think about everything that we've gone through and the things that we had no idea that were coming along the way. I know for me, it's about a week after we did that podcast that I shut down my practice entirely to in-person sessions. We all made
Mm-hmm.
the pivot to being um, remote and doing telehealth, and to think about how far we've all come since then.
Yeah.
It's a little mind-boggling, to be sure.
It's been a wild ride. So I think that Facebook Live still has a lot of valuable stuff in it, and we'll put a link to that in the show notes of this episode for folks who want to go back and rewatch the whole thing. But can you just give us some of like the best of the best? What were some of your practices that you had for folks a year ago that you think still hold true today?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I think this pandemic, especially when you think about a year ago, we had a lot of unknowns going on. We didn't know what this virus was. We didn't know a lot about it, right? This was the stage where there was still a lot of skepticism, even if it was happening. But on the other hand, um, you could tell the anxiety was coming up, and there was this sense of panic. I'm going to talk a little bit more later about kind of the difference between acute anxiety, kind of immediate anxiety, and chronic anxiety. We were definitely in the acute anxiety phase,
Yeah.
and everybody was trying to just hold on, and I think, a couple of the things that I had spoken about a year ago, is that when we're kind of in that immediate state of anxiety, that even just some very basic things, going for walks, getting outside, moving your body, really are helpful anxiety regulation strategies. And I know even as I say that, there's going to be people who say, wait, right, anxiety, right, I need medication, I need a therapist, like going for a walk doesn't do anything. And yes, I hear you. Um, but what that does when we get up, when we get moving, when we kind of embody ourselves, so to speak, it's a helpful way to kind of put yourself back in your body. When we're anxious, sometimes it almost feels a little kind of dissociative, like your mind is elsewhere, right? You kind of feel very out of control, almost like an out of body experience. So the reason I often will encourage my clients, like, I want you to get up, I want to get out of the house, I want you to accomplish something today, because anxiety can feel so paralyzing to folks. That sense of getting up, moving, taking care of yourself, it really does have kind of an outsized benefit, than what some people might think. Again, it's not saying that it's going to cure your anxiety, but we're talking more anxiety regulation. And in those first couple weeks of the pandemic, that's what we were doing, right? We knew why we were anxious, right? We knew there was this global pandemic out there. And the focus for me and with a lot of my clients is, right, how do I help you gain some semblance of control and feeling as if you're not going to completely fall apart. And those things are still practical. I think a lot of times we know what actually is making us anxious, and encouraging folks to find ways to feel embodied, to feel in control, really is an important strategy in kind of regulating yourself amidst that chaos.
Yeah, and so as you were saying, to use your language, like it was very acute then, and now a year later, I imagine it's a bit more chronic. At least the pandemic feels chronic. And so, like, what is different now, and how might we approach taking care of ourselves, self care, regulating our anxiety when we're like a year in? We've been doing this for a while, and also we don't know exactly. It's there's still a ways, at least a little ways ahead of us. Possibly, hopefully, just a few more months, but possibly, I mean, who knows? It could be months or even another year before things really get back to normal. If there's other, who knows if the future if there's gonna be another spike or variants. So, like, what do we do now? It's sort of
Yeah.
like in the middle of this mess.
As you mentioned in my bio, so my training is in Bowen family systems theory, which is kind of a different way. Many therapists use this as a way to kind of approach working with anxiety and in reactive systems. And Bowen talks about the difference between acute anxiety and chronic anxiety. Defined acute anxiety is the fear of what is, chronic anxiety is the fear of what could be. And
Mm-hmm.
so in the beginning of the pandemic, um, the acute anxiety, right? It's right there. You know what you're afraid of. Frankly, right? We're afraid we're going to get the virus. We're afraid we're going to die. We're afraid our loved ones are going to get sick and die. Afraid we can't see them. All of those things are still there,
Mm-hmm.
but there's a lot more of a sense of, look, we've been swimming in this kind of anxiety cloud for over a year now.
Yeah.
Um, we're kind of aware of it, and we've kind of become desensitized to it. This is a rather kind of crude example, but the best way I can kind of describe this is there's this analogy. Chef is going to cook a frog, boil a frog, have some
Yeah.
frog legs. Uh, if you put the frog in a pot of water that's already boiling, the frog will jump out of the pot of water quite quickly. If you put the frog in a pot of water that's cold and slowly turn up the heat, the frog's body will keep adjusting to the heat until it's too late. And at that point, well, you're having frog legs for dinner. That's kind of the way chronic anxiety works. Is the temperature keeps kind of getting turned up, and we adjust. We're actually very adaptable creatures. Think about how quickly so many of us adapted when the pandemic happened, right? So, for instance, I shifted my entire therapy practice online in less than a week. I trained all of my clients how to sign on to, new video conferencing software. I think about in my church how we quickly pivoted to worshiping online, what it looked like to do pastoral care in that way. We made these shifts quite quickly. And especially, I think, for those of us in helping professions, there's this sense of, we adapted so quickly. Um, we don't realize that we are still swimming in kind of this pool of anxiety and this pool of
Mm-hmm.
uncertainty. And I think that's really important to name, because I know so many people are saying, we're burned out, we're done with this. I can resonate with that, in large in part because we've gone on so many months realizing, well, I'm still here, right? Certainly, we've had losses of over 500,000 people in the United States, but I'm still here, right? I found a way to adapt and to get through. And we forget, right, that there still is a global pandemic out there, that we're still dealing with so many unknowns, but our bodies are just not even aware necessarily at a conscious level. That's what chronic anxiety is. It just kind of sits under the surface. And it's really important to recognize that, because that chronic anxiety does cause people to be more on edge, right? Even when we're not aware of it, consciously. Right. All of my clients, especially, this past week, um, I think it's partially coming up on the 1 year, Facebook memories are popping up for people. Right, people are just more short, they're more tired, they're like, I just feel more on edge. That's what chronic anxiety does, right? It keeps us kind of at a simmer right beneath the boil. And it's really important that as we interact with other people, people we love and care about, that we consider that, and have a little bit more grace on people with
Yeah, you
that.
mentioned that like this analogy of like the water sort of like or the temperature slowly getting turned up and we are able to adapt. I know we actually on the podcast last week we were talking about sort of how humans are remarkably adaptive and how that's both like a blessing and sometimes a curse
Hmm.
because we can survive in the midst of like terrible things and then also sometimes like you were saying we don't even always realize just how bad things have gotten because we've adapted and it's sort of like
Right,
right below the surface. And
right.
so what are some ways that we might recognize like when that chronic anxiety is like taking a toll on us or on people that we're interacting with?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a great Bowen scholar. Her name is Kathleen Smith. She wrote a book called "Everything Isn't Terrible."
I love
It's
the
a really
title.
kind of practical. I know, Dr. Smith. I sometimes agree with you. No, but actually, Dr. Smith's book is an excellent resource, and she talks. It's a very accessible approach to Bowen theory, and she talks about kind of the ways we bind anxiety. That's also very kind of therapeutic language. But what we mean by that is we all have ways that when we're anxious, um, that we look for ways to stabilize ourselves, and we often do this without even realizing it. And again, not all of these things are bad. One of the things I remember saying last year, anxiety as a whole is not a bad thing, right? I think we pathologize anxiety as this mental illness or this mental disorder. Another reason why I really like Bowen theory is Bowen's definition of anxiety is it's the body's response to a real or perceived threat. And you notice what's
Mm,
not in that
hmm.
definition. It's not the body's dysfunctional response to a threat. It's not the body's bad or shameful or wrong response. It's the body's response. It is as kind of parallel to someone jumping out and shouting "boo" at you that you jump back. Right? It's reactionary, but that doesn't mean it's bad. In fact, it can be a survival um, process for many of us. Right? Anxiety, right? Fear of getting in a car accident is what reminds us of putting on our seatbelt. Again, right? That doesn't mean we have an anxiety disorder, but rather that our anxiety is saying, okay, I need to take some healthy precautions here. So that's really important. But back to what I was saying about Dr. Smith's book, she talks a lot about in there kind of just very kind of practical ways that people bind anxiety. And they're kind of our cues when we recognize, okay, maybe I am, bubbling a little bit more under the surface. So things like, when you're stressed, you call up a friend to vent to them about another friend, or when you are frustrated with your partner, maybe you suddenly realize that your child is really not doing well in school, and so your focus shifts on creating another problem. These are all ways that we kind of focus that anxious energy on something tangible, and we sometimes will identify people as a problem. Uh, Particularly in Bowen theory, my most often kind of occurrence I'll get is when a family will call me up and they'll say, my kid is not doing well in school, they're acting out. Can you come in and talk to them? And I'll I'll tell the parents to say, well, I'd like to see you all come in. And I tell you what, 9 times out of 10, the kid is not the problem.
Yeah.
The problem is there's some sort of dysfunction in the family system, right? There's some chronic anxiety, right? Maybe there's a family member who's sick, or maybe a parent lost their job, or maybe they just moved 6 months ago. But there's some anxiety in the system that's causing people to focus on something. And so that's such a cue, is when you realize, right, like, wow, I'm really like venting to my partner a lot, or you know, girls' night is really turning into like this session where we just, complain about other people. I could get into the ways that I saw this in the 2020 political season, but we only
Mm.
have so much time today. But I think people
Yeah.
can see those parallels as well, right? Highly anxious system. We kind of look for our teams. We look for our, the we like the silos that we belong to, right? I'm over here, you're over here. And anxiety pushes us to that, to find the people who are on our teams, and to kind of really push away the people who are different than us that we could see as a threat.
Yeah, thanks for all of that. And I've appreciated your sort of like blending of political insight and like from a clinical therapist perspective, and but like both about the 2020 political season, then also just sort of about sort of like the conversations of like white supremacy and racism, and conversations around like queerness in the Christian church, and how like we might think of like the pandemic and racism and queerness and Christianity as like three separate things, but I I found your insights really like illuminating to me about how there's like this like through line of anxiety that shapes how all of those things play out, and noticing is such a powerful first step, and then figuring out like which ways are more productive and which are less productive of addressing
Right.
those anxieties. And so when if folks are able to sort of figure out like, okay, this is sort of an anxious response that I'm having, or like I just know it's been a year of this, I have chronic anxiety about all of this, obviously getting into therapy with a licensed therapist, if you're queer, or really with anyone, honestly, like with a queer affirming therapist, like like not the person at your church who's like kind of a counselor but kind of not, and like also they're like a bit homophobic. Like we're talking about like actual therapists here is obviously like the gold standard. But obviously we all know that both like therapy can sometimes be financially out of reach, or just like sometimes, so I have ADHD, and just like the process of like getting into a therapist and then finding a psychiatrist was just like, if I could manage this process I wouldn't need my therapist.
Right. Right.
So like what are some steps either to like help folks get to a place where they can get into therapy, or do some sort of like immediate work on themselves if that's like not currently
Yeah.
super available to them?
Yeah. So I first want to just like affirm, Brian, even your experience, right, is that getting into therapy is difficult. I will often tell my clients, when they sit down with me in their first session, I'll say, you just did 90% of the work, because
Yeah,
because
it feels
mental
like
health
that.
care is not, yeah, it is not accessible, right? I want to, for those who are listening who maybe don't have this experience, I want to just kind of outline, what this entails, right? So if you recognize that you need to see a therapist, first of all, you want to make sure you find a therapist that's a good fit for you. But easier said than done,
Yeah.
right? It depends on what your health insurance is. It depends if they're taking new clients. If you have a high deductible health insurance plan, right? So you're still paying out of pocket,
Mm-hmm,
right?
mm-hmm.
So many barriers. Another issue, right, is even just getting the therapist to call you back. So, for instance, right, I fully acknowledge, right, that even in our practice, right, our office manager is telling us we're getting close to 75 to 80 calls a day of
Oh
people
wow.
calling up. We have 15 therapists on staff. We're all full, booking out, 4 to 6 months. And I think people are like, wait, why does it take so long? Well, because once you're in a practice, it's not like a regular doctor's office where you come once every 6 months,
Right.
right? We are carving out a block of time for you every week. And it's in fact going to be more detrimental, right, if we start you, but then can't see you again for 6 weeks because we got you in on a cancellation.
Right.
Another thing, right, to keep in mind is, right, we're going to be seeing you for 45 minutes to an hour, depending on the modality of the therapist. It's very different than going to your doctor where they're seeing you for 15 minutes at most, right?
Right.
So even just the number of clients we can see in a day is
Right.
less. Um, so I want to affirm for all of you who are listening that are having a hard time getting into a therapist that this is an ongoing problem in our field. I don't have an easy solution to it, but it's a reality, right? And I want to name that for folks, and to say that if you're not getting calls back, that's not your fault. That's not that they're not deliberately calling you back. Um, right. I work through, right. I'm working 10, 12 hours a day. And then, come 9 o'clock at night, I've got to call back 20 people and say, I can't get you in for another, 3 to 6 months. It's hard. And we acknowledge that reality. In the meantime, though, what you can do, to kind of work with yourself, um, one of the things I always try and affirm for my clients, right, is you are your own expert. I am not the expert of your life. When we talk about how therapists are kind of experts in the field of mental health, I think part of that, has been the medical model, right? That has really said, right, you go to the doctor, you say, hey, doc, I'm having a sore throat. They give you penicillin, take two, call me in the morning. Mental health care is not like that, right? We are inviting, or rather, we are being, as clinicians, being invited into your lives, and to really help you kind of sort through what's going on, right? To really help you identify uh, what are the goals you want to work on, what are the things that are working, what are the things that are not working. Kind of, this is the idea of the therapist as being somewhat of a neutral party, right, to kind of mirror back to you. And sometimes having that other perspective is really helpful. Um, but I also want to affirm, right, like that is not like something that we learn in our classes, right? Our classes teach us in grad school maybe good techniques and strategies, but also there are people out there that will listen, um, and can affirm and work with you, that are not clinicians, right? I think again, going back to this idea of anxiety, what's really important is to find people who are not just going to tell you what you want to hear, right? There's definitely a comfort in that, right? Somebody to vent to. We all need that, but somebody who's also going to be able to call it like it is. Um, and that's where we often see some resistance, right? So knowing that you have some trusted people, who are going to be able to say the hard thing to you and say, actually, what if we thought about it this way instead? That's really one of the things that I encourage clients to look for, is to know that they're going to have somebody who's going to shoot straight with them, and we can find that in people around us that are not clinicians as well.
Yeah, as someone who does a lot of work around sort of like romantic relationships, I find myself like constantly stressing the importance of just like platonic friendships. I like, or I guess also like maybe friends that you are sometimes more than platonic, but like that friendships are, or like including of like family members that you also like might be friends with, are so important. And people like not that just that you like hang out with or you watch TV with or you go to like drag show with or the football game or like whatever it might be, but that you can like be like deeply vulnerable with, and like share your fears and your anxieties and your hopes and your dreams, and that they can like make space and hold all of that. And obviously like our friends, like friends and therapists serve different roles in our lives, but I totally can see the value in some of my friendships. And I'll also say that many of my like deepest friendships don't live in the same city as me. That either, like Shay, who I do queer theology with, we met in person like through our mutual really good friend Micah, but we hung out like maybe a few times in group settings in New York. And then he moved and then I moved, and but like we spend lots of time like texting and talking and FaceTiming. Like before Zoom was a thing, we were on Google Hangouts. And so like to be able to find those, whether they're like people that you know in person who then move away or you kept in touch with, or even like friends online, can really be super meaningful. And so if you're feeling like there's no one who fully affirms you or who gets you that you can be vulnerable with, like taking the time, obviously like especially as adults, like making friends is easier said than done, but I think like such a valuable practice of like finding folks out there, you can like show up with, is going to be a huge part of this
Right.
process.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and certainly again, people that are gonna, shoot straight with you,
Yeah.
right? I think, one of the things that I find, in my practice, right, is the ability to kind of sit with the anger and the frustration and things, right? That I think that is definitely something that, you want to look for, right? Somebody who's not just going to gas you up all the time, right? Like that's important, right? You want people who are going to affirm you. But it's also not super helpful when they are also affirming, um, how do I want to say this? Affirming the thing that you're anxious about, which can sometimes drive us deeper into anxiety, right? So if I have an issue with my partner and I go to my best friend and I say, "You'll never believe, what they did, blah 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 blah," and they're like, "Oh yeah, they're so awful, and right, you totally need to leave them and everything," right? That might actually be detracting me from addressing, what's actually going on in me, right? What's going on in my relationship, right? So finding again those places that are going to say, "Okay, right, I hear what you're saying. Have you thought about it this way?" Those are going to be the friends who are really going to matter, who can really kind of call it like it is, in cases like that.
Yeah, I love that you like, sort of part of that was like phrases a question. Like, if you thought about it this way, that I find that like friends who ask me like questions can sort of like sometimes I like if they've got like a little bit of an agenda, like they can see something that I
Yeah,
don't, and but they come at it with a question can be super helpful. And I know for me, when I'm talking with my friends, trying to find that balance of like affirming their feelings and their sort of like internal reality, or maybe even sort of like the external circumstances, like you did get fired, like your mom did say something transphobic, like XYZ, whatever it might be, and also like leading them or engaging with them in a way that like invites introspection and growth rather than just sort of like we like stew in this like cloud of anxiety. I think as you said earlier, I love that imagery.
yeah,
And
yeah,
it's something that you just like. I'm not a therapist. It's something that you should like learn by doing and by practicing and by perhaps like reading some books. Yeah. So thank you for all of that.
and even to that point, I might, even say this is, I think, one of the things that right, that I'll acknowledge, right, is kind of controversial, but this idea that, at the end of the day, we might have people, right, who are queer phobic, transphobic, biphobic in our lives. Right, our friends might say, "Oh yeah, they're trash. We need to cancel them. They're awful people. Leave them behind." What I will invite, my clients to consider, right? I'm always going to emphasize, safety first, right? Do what you need to do to be safe, but also to say, look, the only person that we can control is ourselves, right? If any of my clients ever listen to this podcast, they'll recognize immediately I say that probably 30 times in a session, right? The only person that you can control is yourself. And as such, from that premise, then how do you want to move forward, right? So, I see this when queer folk are talking about, yes, I know, my parents are not affirming, but I can't let them go, right? And I totally get that, um, right? And so in those cases, right, I help them to work with, so how do you continue to show up authentically, right? Non-reactively, authentically, well differentiated, very firm in who you are as a person, right? This is really kind of the focus of my work, is to say, look, I can't change them. I can't, and you can't change them either, right? You can give them information. You can tell them what this means. You can use those I feel statements. You can talk about the impact, but at the end of the day, you can't change them. They will only change when they are ready to change. And so therapeutically, how do I help you show up authentically, non-reactively, with integrity, right, in those spaces? Sometimes that means, right, with integrity, we say, no, I'm not going to, uh, subject myself to this. But for those who do want to be in relationship with people who are not fully affirming of themselves, I want to encourage them. How do you do that authentically? I think sometimes, there is this sense of, anybody who doesn't affirm you, you're just supposed to write them off entirely and run away. But you and I, Brian, both know, right,
Yeah.
that is a much more complicated reality, especially for LGBTQ Christians, right?
Yeah.
Going back to families and churches and places that we want to belong, and acknowledging that that's part of the journey for folks too. I can't just say, "Oh, you just need to leave them behind." No, as a therapist, I want to help them self-determine. Say, "Look, if this is where you want to go and want to belong, I want to affirm that and help you feel confident in those decisions."
Yeah.
to feel like you can do them with integrity. Yeah.
That's
Hmm.
so important. I know there's like a part of me that, is very sort of like, should or get off the pot.
Hmm.
And I think like with my family of origin, they were kind of like wishy-washy for like a number of years, and were like not, they weren't like hostile necessarily. Well, they're kind of hostile looking back on it. It didn't seem hostile at the time. Like they didn't disown me, they didn't kick me out, but they like definitely weren't affirming. And at some point I just sort of was like started to draw more firm lines, and so that, and that like worked for me. And so I
Yeah,
recognize that
yeah.
I'm kind of a like, I I have that impulse in me, but I also need to recognize that like, but I lived in that sort of uncertainty for a number of years, and I still live in that uncertainty with like my partner's parents, and like, with all sorts of different people. And there's not like a one size fits all answer. And like you were saying, there's like more
Absolutely.
nuance, especially with LGBTQ folks.
Well, and I think too, this idea, so to kind of go back to where we started, right? This idea of everybody's on edge,
Yeah.
right? We live in, society with a lot of anxiety. I don't like the term polarization, right? I think sometimes that kind of feels a little
Mm,
like whitewashy, but I use this idea, right, that we're all kind of swimming in anxiety, right? And if you think about it, right, it's so multifaceted. Economic fear, right? Do I have enough money to pay rent, to buy food, to pay for my medication, to pay for therapy, right? Kind of anxiety around race, not racial anxiety.
right.
Racism is real, but anxiety around race for people of color, right? Am I going to be safe stepping out my front door? All of these components, right? We're kind of swimming in this and recognizing, look, we are all on edge right now. And when we're on edge, it makes it so much harder to take in information, right? So,
Mm,
kind of the fight flight response.
yeah.
Um, so, when we're living in this chronic anxiety, we're kind of stuck in it's the back of the brain, it's your amygdala. It's the part of the brain that's focused on survival. And when we're living in this state of, anxiety, again, the body's response to a threat. So when we constantly feel like we are under threat, we're kind of near constantly in fight or flight mode and we don't even recognize it. But, so that can explain why people feel so reactionary. But the other part that I think people don't often recognize is when we are in that state of fight or flight, we are not in a state of kind of rational, logical information processing, right? So that's the prefrontal cortex. It's the part of the brain, um, the front part of the brain that takes in facts and processes information. So you think about that, right? So when we are chronically in a state of anxiety, and again, that anxiety, it's kind of one size fits all in the sense that um, the anxieties that a white, straight, cisgender male pastor has around losing his job if he comes out as an affirming pastor, um, is working kind of psychologically in the same sort of anxiety
Mm,
way as the terrified LGBTQ identified youth who's afraid to come out to their parents, right? I'm not saying that the experience
right.
is equal, but
Yeah.
the way that it works on the brain, anxiety, right, is the great equalizer in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
That both of those individuals are in that fight or flight mode, and I think that's really important because it means when you're engaging with someone who feels wishy-washy, who feels like they're not taking a side, I'm always mindful of, what's the anxiety in the system here, right? What are they worried about? And until I'm able to work with that, I'm recognizing that a lot of that, boom, it's just bouncing off the prefrontal cortex, right? That they're not actually able to take in and process until I'm able to get them out of that state of anxiety. And I think that's a nuance that I think we lose sometimes. And certainly, I'm not saying that this is the responsibility of every LGBTQIA person or every person of color. This is uniquely how I, right, as a trained therapist, right, who voluntarily chose to enter into this field, work with folks like this, right? When I do consulting with pastors who have anxiety in their churches around this topic, and they tell me, Jonathan, I'm afraid that my church is going to split, and right, I could lose my job, right? I have two kids. Right. I think it's really easy to be dismissive and say, well, you don't know what LGBTQ people lost, right, in this. But I recognize that coming in like that, they're already in that hijacked fight or flight mode. There's no way that I can move them to a place of kind of conviction until I get them out of that. So I need, as a therapist and a coach, right? I help affirm that anxiety, right? I help them identify, so who are you, right? What grounds you? What is your sense of identity? How do you want to show up authentically? And to proceed from there, I think as we talk about, you know, this frustration, right, with people who can't pick sides, I think that's an important reminder. Again, it doesn't excuse the harm that is caused in the meantime, but it's an acknowledgement to say, um, this is why sometimes it's hard to get people out of that kind of wishy-washy, unable to take a position side. And this is again, if you're listening to this, and you're a pastor or a parent who feels stuck, you're afraid of what you could lose. I want to validate that fear, but I also want to encourage you, for the sake of the LGBTQ people in your lives, right? Find a therapist, talk this out with someone,
Yeah.
figure out, um, right? So you can respond with integrity and not from a reactionary place of anxiety that could end up hurting other people along the way.
I really appreciated how you underscore that this isn't the responsibility of every single LGBTQ person or every
Absolutely
person
not.
of
Yeah.
color to sort of take on that. Like,
Hmm.
it's you voluntarily step into these spaces and conversations as a trained therapist, or this might be work for like a coach to do, or a leader, or even like sometimes individual people who are feeling like a calling to that as like a vocation, or just sort of like I've got a lot of energy and I'm up for the conversation today, but maybe not tomorrow. It's
Right.
not something
Right.
that we all have to deal with. And I think to tie it into this moment that like if you're a queer person and you're like we're a year into a pandemic and you're like really on edge and swimming in a lot of stuff, like now does not have to be the time that you confront your parent or try to like change the policies of your church like over Zoom. Like it's okay to recognize like this is a moment where I've got to like take care of myself for a little bit, and so like be mindful of that anxiety
Yeah.
cloud that we're
Yeah.
swimming in, especially heightened because of the pandemic right now.
Right. Right. The pandemic, again, which is kind of how we got started talking about
Yeah.
this, right? Is um, right, again, we are not even aware yet fully of the effects that this has had on folks, right?
Mhm.
So, um, I know you had asked me to kind of think about, where are we now a year later? And what I'm seeing, right, is the trauma, right, is really starting to kind of come out. Um, because again, for many of us, we've been in survival mode. And once we got out of survival mode, right, we were just trying to keep going, right? We kept pushing through. Um, I think about, this is often the way that it is, with movements towards affirmation of LGBTQ people, right? This idea of this urgency that's always going, going, going.
Mhm,
And then
mhm.
you get near the end, and suddenly, right, you kind of feel like you're going to fall apart. And this is actually what I'm seeing. And
Yeah.
it's surprising to a lot of people. They're like, wait, I maybe just got my second vaccine, right? Or, my parents got vaccinated, they could hug their grandchildren for the first time in a year. Why am I feeling more on edge? And what I say is, right, your body is only beginning to process, right? You finally have some capacity for that, right? So, kind of tying these two threads together that we've been talking about,
Yeah.
trauma shows up in unusual ways. I think about trauma as um, the analogy I use with my clients is trauma is like if you're standing on a rug and someone comes up behind you and pulls it out from underneath you. It's this idea that the fabric of the universe essentially was yanked out, and you're stumbling and you're catching, you're kind of catching your balance and everything. This is what the pandemic did, right? It kind of ripped out from underneath us. And for many people, for the first time, the idea that we live in a world that's stable and safe, right? And sure, there's some privilege in that, but I think universally, right, there's this idea that everything that we knew was ripped out from underneath us. And again, we pushed hard to adapt, but now that we are able to kind of have some breathing room, all of those losses, all of the grief that we have pushed aside, that we'd said we're going to deal with this later, is all coming back in this tidal wave.
Mhm, mhm.
And I think as we continue, right, moving towards summer and things opening up more, as more people get vaccinated, I think we're really going to see a strong subset of people that are going to be hit with very unusual waves of grief, right? Um, they'll be going out, to be around friends and just feel like I can't connect to them, right? I feel very disconnected. Um, Having opportunities to go hug family members that they haven't seen in a year, but um, you know, feel feeling very nervous about that. People having, anxiety attacks going into grocery stores for the first time. I think this is normal, and I think it's something that we really need to be prepared for because everybody's going to come out of this differently because everybody's been in this differently. And again, right, the connection to doing advocacy in the church for LGBTQ people, a lot of these are the same parallels. For some people, this work is actually not going to be that traumatizing at all, right? They've got really good self care and support. For other people, right, they're going to come out of it with years of trauma. And we don't often know what that's going to look like for every person. So, again, encouraging people to be gentle with one another. We don't, that saying, right, you don't know the battles that other people have been facing.
Yeah.
Um, a really good reminder.
Yeah, totally. I really love that we explored a little bit about like LGBTQ, like inclusion and affirmation in the church because, obviously sort of the premise of queertheology.com is that like queerness has like something to offer the conversation of faith, not just like defending against that we are not like what we are not, like not sick, not sinful, but that like when you bring queerness to Christianity or to the Bible or to faith, like it unlocks like something new and it adds something vibrant. And so I hadn't even thought about that until this conversation that like queerness, like queering the pandemic, that like our queer experience also, when we look at it through that lens, like has some things to teach us about this particular moment that we find ourselves in. So thank you for sort of making those connections for us. As we wind
Absolutely.
up, and and you were sort of you started to talk about this a little bit with sort of as we're nearing the end, hopefully, potentially, people are getting their second shots, like places are starting to reopen maybe. What are some things that folks like could or should be mindful of now that like the end seems potentially in sight?
So I think, again, it's this recognition that many of us were in fight or flight mode to begin with. And just because the
Mm,
pandemic is quote unquote ending doesn't mean that we are not still in fight or flight mode, right? For many people, the questions around paying your bills, dysfunctional situations at work, family of origin stuff, right? That's still there,
yeah.
right? The
White
pandemic kind
supremacy
of
isn't
was
going
like this.
away.
Right,
Yeah.
right. This pandemic was like a blanket, right, that sat on top of so much, but like it's still there. And I think what's really important, right, is to recognize we are all on edge. One of the kind of helpful reframes I think with this pandemic has been is this idea that we've been grieving, we've been collectively grieving the loss of what we knew. And that looks a little different for each person, but I think about even like the stages of grief, right? Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. In recognizing that, like, we're all in one of those stages. Those stages are not linear, right? You can jump forward, you can jump back.
Yeah.
But thinking about how even when this is quote unquote over, the grief remains, right? The
Mm,
loss of a year
mhm.
remains. The plans that were put on hold remain. The experiences that were not realized remain. And grief sits with people for a long time and it manifests in different ways. I think, again, this is really important because I think for so many of us, we're kind of running out of patience a little bit, right? I want to name, right, that
Mhm,
for some of
mhm.
you, like, yeah, you're absolutely, like, saying, "Throw caution to the wind, I'm gonna do this," right? I'm not here to shame you, I'm here to say I get it, right? I understand why for so many of us we're at that place, um, and I think, again, like, I see it more and more, the shaming of, what to do, what not to do, what's right, what's wrong, but realizing, right, we are connected people, like, we need those connections, we need the ability to be with people, and that's hard, people are making hard choices. And as we grieve this year of loss collectively, right? And again, think of all the other things that we lost, right? Think of all the, um, everything going on, right in Minneapolis, George Floyd,
Mhm,
Breonna Taylor, right? All of that was put on top of the pandemic, right?
mhm.
And then on top of that, right, all of um, the stuff with the election, right? It
Yeah.
was just like one, two, three, right
Yes.
after another. I said spring was pandemic, Summer was, racial justice. Fall was the election. Winter was the grief around like winter blues, like holiday,
Hmm.
right? Like so, each season, not that you ended one, but each one like
The
piled
hits
on a
keep coming.
new,
Yeah.
right, a
Yeah.
new layer. So right, okay, so the pandemic is done, but what other traumas and griefs are still there? So again, even as you're coming out of the pandemic, all of these other things are still there that need to be processed. So again, I want to encourage us, right, to be gentle. Again, that doesn't mean you have to say, right, like you're excusing queer phobia or racism, but recognizing that we are all on edge right now, that we're all in that amygdala uh, fight or flight mode, which means we're not necessarily at our best thinking the most rationally all the time. Um, so even like if you're engaging with somebody and they seem extra reactive, like okay, like it's probably not about you, right? There's probably some things right underneath the surface that are going on. So
Yeah. And to be gentle, not only with others, but also to be gentle with ourselves is so important.
absolutely, absolutely.
Well, thank you, Reverend Jonathan, so much for being on the podcast today and sharing your wisdom with us. If folks want to connect more with you or your work, where could they go and find you?
Yeah, so I'm actually, not really that much on social media these days. That was a kind of a self-care
Yeah,
thing
totally.
for myself. But if folks do want to reach out to me, Brian, I will give you my email, and folks can email me. So after we are done here, I'm sure you can do some magical post podcast editing and put that up there. It's long, so I don't want to spell it out on here, but yeah, so I can make that available to folks who
Yeah,
want to reach
totally.
out and connect. So
We'll put that in
yep,
the show notes of this
yeah,
episode.
absolutely. So
Great. Well, thanks so much.
absolutely. Thanks for having me. And yeah, here's to another year. So.
Amen. Here's to another year.